It had been 2.5 weeks since Paulus had been surrounded at Stalingrad, with not a lot going on in terms of the front line moving. Apart from getting his units across the Don and into the Stalingrad pocket, and apart from the odd fight here or there, the front line had largely stayed as it was in late November. For this entire time, the 6th Army just sat there starving. Which is why a lot of the books, both historians and also authors like Hapt, skip over this period entirely. Admittedly, we could have also skipped over it, but it's worth emphasising what we've just seen. 2.5 weeks where the Germans did nothing. They were so slow at bringing up reinforcements and launching their counterattack that we waited in 3 entire episodes for Manstein to actually get going. Meanwhile, the 6th Army did little more than eat away their precious supplies. And, spoiler alert, it's going to be another week and a bit before Manstein's offensive gives 6th Army its opportunity to break out. So it's a huge period of 5 weeks where the 6th Army is slowly drained of its strength. Then people ask, why didn't the 6th Army break out? Well, because by the time that 5 weeks was up, it was too late. They were starved. That's why we didn't skip over this period. It's a critical period of time, even though nothing much actually happened. But by skipping it, we can create propaganda. The commander of Army Group Don, Field Marshal von Manstein, immediately set out to relieve Stalingrad. No, he didn't! He immediately set out 2.5 weeks later. You can't make this up. But anyway, on the 12th of December 1942, Operation Winter Thunderstorm began. Behind the lines, Manstein had gathered 800 vehicles with 3,000 tons of supplies ready for the 6th Army. So, if his attack succeeded, Paulus's men would get what they needed. All he had to do was go the distance, 120 kilometres. But could his meagre forces actually do that? Manstein's force had assembled by 0430 hours and attacked at 0515 hours. The 114th Panzer Grenadier Regiment pinned down the remnants of the 81st Cavalry Division and 85th Tank Brigade as the 11th Panzer Regiment struck their flank. Both units were taken by surprise and routed, with the 85th Tank Brigade losing 10 of their remaining 14 tanks, essentially wiping out the unit. The cavalry fled north in disarray, with the Germans following, and at some point they captured the headquarters of the 302nd Rifle Division, which also had been routed. We are passing fleeing Russian infantry and gunned them down with our machine guns. Anyone who's not coming towards us with hands raised is being mowed down. But why waste ammunition on these few men? Better to let them run. They will either starve or freeze in the steppe, or surrender themselves at a later time. The 126th Rifle Division fell back in the face of the 23rd Panzer and the Romanian Cavalry Group Popescu. In other words, the 2 German panzer divisions and an ad hoc Romanian force had completely broken the 51st Army's western defences and had advanced 18 miles in less than a day, and this had come at the low cost of just 15 men lost for the 6th Panzer Division. But it wasn't over. Beuneberg disbanded Kampfgruppe Illig and formed a slightly larger Kampfgruppe led by von Heydebreck. Raus also ordered his panzers to resume their advance under the cover of darkness, but Colonel von Hunnersdorf refused, stating that the tanks would be nearly blind and might slip into ravines in the ice. So there was a bit of a delay until after midnight as the Germans reorganised themselves. And even before the day was out, Trefanov, Yeremenko and Vasilevsky could see that the situation for them was terrible. Even Shumilov had reacted by moving 2 rifle divisions to his left flank as a reserve force, plus 3 anti-tank and 2 Katyusha regiments. Tolbukin also moved 2 tank regiments to his rear, creating a counter-attacking force that then moved south to join the 87th Rifle Division. But it was obvious that Trefanov didn't have a chance in the face of 2 German panzer divisions, so Vasilevsky rang Stalin to discuss the crisis. He couldn't get through though, and therefore spoke to Rokossovsky of the Don front, ordering him to change his plans. Rokossovsky was preparing to destroy the 6th Army and had been assigned the 2nd Guards Army, now coming from the west. But Manstein's relief attempt was now the priority, so Vasilevsky wanted to take the 2nd Guards Army off Rokossovsky and divert it south to stop Manstein. Rokossovsky was obviously reluctant to relinquish control over the 2nd Guards Army, and an argument ensued between the two generals, with Vasilevsky threatening to ring Stalin. But again, the lines were busy and he couldn't get through. When he did finally make contact with the dictator that evening, he asked Stalin for permission to send the 2nd Guards Army south, and Stalin was angry at what he thought was an attempt to force him into a decision. He refused to give an answer and forced Vasilevsky to spend a very anxious night. Stalin, like Rokossovsky, still wanted the 2nd Guards Army to destroy the 6th Army first, so he decided not to make the decision until he had discussed the situation with the State Defense Committee. Thus, Trofanov was on his own for the time being. Still, Yeremenko could give him some reinforcements. Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps was transferred to 51st Army on this day and would arrive on the 14th. Vasilevsky also ordered Yeremenko to take the 87th Rifle Division and the 235th Flamethrower Tank Brigade from his reserve and throw them into a counterattack that Trofanov had reluctantly agreed to. Tanishchin's 13th Tank Corps was ordered to reinforce Trofanov as well, so reinforcements were on their way. In fact, Tanishchin started to move immediately and was hoping to counterattack on the 12th, but his force came under attack from Stukas, which delayed him enough that the counterattack was postponed until the next day. "Manstein is coming! Manstein is coming!" the shouts went along the frozen Balkas in the castle between the Don and the Volga. Soldiers cheered his name and repeated stories of his genius to each other. Manstein, whose plan to outflank the Maginot Line had led to the fall of France within 6 weeks. Manstein, who reduced the Crimean fortress city of Sevastopol within days. Listening to these stories, the men of the 6th Army gloated over the coming of the hook-nosed, silver-haired legend and laughed at their temporary status of mice in a mousetrap. Speaking of Manstein, the Field Marshal complained to Richthofen on this day, saying that Richthofen's Chief of Staff, Roden, wasn't working well with his own Chief of Staff, Major General Schultz. It was entirely Roden's fault, Manstein said, and the rest of Manstein's staff were also in agreement. Richthofen therefore argued with Roden on this day, with Richthofen complaining in his diary that Roden wasn't taking care of essential things. Apparently, Roden's orders were pointless, and he was neglecting the subordinate units. My reading of this is that Roden may be another factor in why the airlift wasn't as fully organised as it could be, or why the morale in the Luftwaffe was falling. In support of Manstein's attack, the Luftwaffe had concentrated on bombing Soviet airfields, lines of communication, and bases in the rear areas. They had only brought down one Soviet plane, though, throughout this entire day, but Colonel Adam had, on the 12th, flown back into the Stalingrad pocket. Upon touching down, he viewed the scene before him at Potomnik Airfield. The place was overflowing with crashed aircraft and destroyed vehicles. There a Condor, here a Focke-Wulf. Among the wrecks were several Ju-52s and He-111s, the work of the Red bombers and fighters. He describes how, not long after he had landed, that Soviet bombers flew over them and hit the airfield. Apparently, these bombers came almost every hour, adding to the carnage. Falk says that the Soviets bombed Potomnik 42 times between the 6th and 12th of December, so Adams' report is not unreasonable. And a chaplain in the 76th Infantry Division also noted in his diary that Ju-52s loaded with wounded were shot up by Soviet fighter bombers on this day. But in addition to the condition of the airfield, Adam also describes powerless himself. The catastrophic situation of his army was consuming him. The nervous sucking in of his face seemed no longer to be heard. Head and shoulders were more strongly bent forwards than before. There was bitter disappointment in his words. He was unhappy with himself and his dealings. He goes on to describe a conversation he had with Paulus, where Paulus says he had been forbidden to leave Stalingrad by the Führer. Adam supposedly suggested that breaking out was the right thing to do, which Paulus dismissed by saying that a breakout would only succeed if the Sixth Army acted in harmony with the intentions of the High Command. This implies that Paulus was unwilling to disobey the Führer and that it was Hitler's fault for not issuing breakout orders. I will point out, though, that Adam is writing out entire paragraphs of what he and Paulus supposedly said, and he's writing this years after he supposedly said them. So these aren't stenographic records or even based on notes like the Hitler's table talks were. So there's no way he could recall the exact words of a conversation years after the event, which then undermines the idea that Paulus said any of this stuff. I will also point out that the reason Paulus isn't breaking out is because he can't. He doesn't have enough fuel. We'll come back to this in a bit. So whether he's willing to disobey the Führer or not, he physically can't do what Adam is implying. However, we do actually have a stenographic account of a conference on the 12th where Hitler did say something that backs up the idea that he didn't want to leave Stalingrad.
"We should under no circumstances give this up. We won't get it back once it's lost. We can't replace what we have in there. If we abandon it, we abandon the whole purpose for this campaign. To think that I will come here next time is madness. We won't come back here, so we can't leave it. There has been too much bloodshed to do this."
As some historians have pointed out, the original purpose of the campaign was to get to the oil of the Caucasus, not Stalingrad. However, without the Sixth Army holding the Volga and the Don areas, there's no way they could stop the Soviets from reaching Rostov and cutting off Axis forces in the Caucasus. So it is technically correct that the loss of the Sixth Army would result in the failure of the campaign. There were more discussions at this conference, such as whether Manstein should receive the 16th Motorized and 17th Panzer Divisions, as well as other things, and it's a very revealing conference that undermines some of what Manstein and the other generals are saying. It is worth discussing, but I didn't want to bog down this series with a discussion on it, so I've done a whole video on the conference as an addendum video, which you can find on the channel. I'll leave a link in the description.
Back along the Cher River area, Manstein had wanted to launch an attack towards Stalingrad in addition to the one from Kotornikovo, but this had been foiled by the Soviet Cher or Tomosin offensive, which was still going on. Now, though, the Germans were counterattacking. 15th Panzer Regiment was sent to reinforce the 336th Infantry Division, and with this support the Germans managed to take Lisinski. However, the 15th Panzer and 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiments were then ordered to move northwestwards as the Soviet 5th Mechanized Corps had attacked the German lines near Surovikino that morning. Despite local superiority, the Soviets had advanced barely 2 or 3 kilometers, and the 11th Panzer Division's reaction of striking the Soviets' eastern flank checked the Soviet advance, even if it failed to drive the Soviets back. By this point, Balk's 11th Panzer Division was down to little more than 50 tanks, and was struggling to keep the Soviets from gaining ground, let alone try and strike towards Stalingrad. It's therefore correct to conclude that the Soviet 5th Tank Army helped doom the 6th Army by preventing the northern pincer of the relief attack from even being attempted. Worse, by the end of the day, Lenenka's 4th Guards Rifle Division had concentrated opposite the Rajkovsky bridgehead, meaning that pressure was continuing to mount on the 48th Panzer Corps, and there was little chance that the situation would improve in the near future. Having been robbed of HE-111s in order to support Manstein's relief attack, Fiebig was only able to deliver either 80 or 111 tons, depending on the source. As a result, the men of the Sixth Army were complaining. The rations were becoming leaner. It was lucky that we old Hot Truppen still had horses which were distributed amongst all divisions. They formed the main rations of our troops. When prisoners were taken, our men first looked to see if the enemy still had anything edible. I cannot have more than 2 slices of bread, otherwise there would be nothing for the morning. You cannot get fat on it, but it's enough for me. Eating a great deal is just a habit. Shortly after midnight, in the early hours of the 13th of December 1942, Raus's Panzer and Panzer Grenadiers advanced rapidly to the north and got across the Aksai River in the Chikov area by 0800 hours. The regiment commander's tank broke down on the bridge, or the bridge collapsed. There's conflicting accounts, and this blocked the other vehicles from crossing, causing a delay. But shortly afterwards, Kampfgruppe Hunnersdorf moved off to take Verkhney Kumsky, more than a dozen kilometres to the north. As a result, this advance left 23rd Panzer Division well to the rear, which would cause problems in the near future. 23rd Panzer Division had been delayed not because of the enemy, since 302nd Rifle Division had been shattered the previous day, but because of General Hott, who intervened and warned them that an enemy tank brigade was approaching from the north. Some tanks did appear and were defeated, but otherwise it was Hott's intervention that created the gap between the two panzer divisions. Raus reacted by moving the 6th Reconnaissance Battalion into the gap, as well as a battalion from the 114th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. On the Soviet side, Tanishchin's 13th Tank Corps was slow to get going, and after the previous Stuka attacks, had just 28 tanks left out of the 49 it had the day before. Nonetheless, it struck against the two lone battalions from the 6th Panzer Division, along with the remnants of the 302nd Rifle Division. 23rd Panzer Division managed to intervene and push the Soviets back slightly, but otherwise the fight here ended in a stalemate. At the same time, the 235th Tank Brigade and 234th Tank Regiment were approaching the 6th Panzer Division's positions north of the Aksai, and Stukas were called out against them. Clearly though, the noose was slowly tightening around the 57th Panzer Corps. Could they keep going, or would Manstein's attack bog down? Let's find out. Both Glantz and Isayev note that in his memoirs, Raus had once again condensed what happened over the next few days into one day. So if you're reading Raus, you need to be careful. But the result of this is that it's not entirely clear exactly how events played out in the Verkhney-Kumsky area. So the account for this part of the battle may not be 100% how it happened in reality, but it's the best we can do with the sources we have available. Hunnersdorf spotted Soviet tanks north of him and immediately called on Stukas to help destroy them. It's not clear which unit this was because the sources are all over the place. There is in fact an entire debate over it. But looking at the map, it's probably the 55th Tank Regiment. If it was this, then the 55th Tank Regiment was then encircled by Kampfgruppe Hunnersdorf. Then the 234th Tank Regiment hit them from the east, trying to save the 55th, but wasn't able to break through. Then the 235th Tank Brigade turned up, striking into a gap between Hunnersdorf and the units to the south. Hunnersdorf sent his two panzer battalions against the flanks of the Soviet brigade, doing a lot of damage and forcing it to withdraw. Regardless of the exact details, this all happened over the course of a couple of days, so we just need to bear that in mind as this episode goes on. The Germans claim that as many as 110 Soviet tanks were destroyed in this action, although it was probably less. Both sides realised the importance of Manstein's offensive and the actions south of Stalingrad. In the early morning, Stalin finally granted Vasilevsky's request to transfer the 2nd Guards Army south to block the German relief effort. But there was some good news for Manstein. Hitler released the 17th Panzer Division to General Hott's control on the 13th of December. Unfortunately, it would take time to move from the Morozovsk region to the front, 100 kilometers away, so in the meantime Manstein would have to do without. What I also think is interesting is that in his lost victories, Manstein completely misses out what happened during his relief operation between the initial attack on the 12th and the arrival of the 17th Panzer Division a few days later. Even Hapt doesn't do that. Hapt at least says that the attack stopped and that 6th Panzer Division had to go on the defensive, losing a lot of men and vehicles. But Manstein doesn't mention that his attack was stalled on the second day because of Soviet resistance. He doesn't go into any detail at all, probably because
That would go against his overarching narrative that he was an amazing general and that the Germans lost their battles and the Soviets didn't win them. No, his tactics in this battle, if you can even call them that, were to move forwards. There were no genius strategies or movements or anything like that. It was just move forwards.
There was no real surprise outside of the usual tactical variety, and no real manoeuvre either. The two panzer divisions drove northeast, straight up the rail line out of Kotelnikovo. Overall, the situation for the Germans was dire. Richthofen accused Hoth's troops of fumbling around against a weak enemy instead of getting onto their objective. And on the 13th of December, Popov's 5th Shock Army launched its own attacks against the German positions at the Scher. The 2,000 men of Group Mikosch were completely surprised and overwhelmed by Rotmistrov's 7th Tank Corps and lost Rajkovsky within 50 minutes of being attacked. Other German forces were also forced out of Verkhney Cherskaya by several Soviet units after a 5-hour fight, with the 315th Rifle Division clearing portions of the area east of the Don, where a small German Kampfgruppe continued to hold on. After a 5-hour fight, the town of Verkhney Chersky fell to Rotmistrov's tanks, a task that 1st Tank and 3rd Guard Cavalry Corps had failed to accomplish in more than 2 weeks of heavy fighting. 11th Panzer Division couldn't be sent to help out because it was also attacked by the 5th Tank Army, and one of its Panzer Grenadier battalions was encircled as the Soviets broke through the lines between the boundary between it and the 336th Infantry Division. Balck had to call back the 15th Panzer and 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiments to send them to rescue the surrounded battalion, which they did, but 11th Panzer Division was basically being used to shore up the line and had no hope of striking towards Stalingrad. The Germans had about 33 panzers left, while the 5th Tank Army alone had around 65. Rotmistrov still had hundreds of tanks left as well, so Knobelsdorff faced a dilemma. His entire front was in danger of collapsing, but he also faced Soviet tanks coming from his flanks. He therefore had to pull back and consolidate, which he began to do. In the evening, Knobelsdorff ordered Group Schmidt to withdraw from Sorovikino so that it could reinforce the defences of Group Zeller and the 336th Infantry Division.
However, the Soviets couldn't continue their advance as hoped. Popov told Rotmistrov to advance, but not to let his tanks cross the Scher in the Nizhny Cherskaya area. Why? Because his tanks were needed in the south to stop the 57th Panzer Corps' advance towards Stalingrad. So Manstein's southern pincer had effectively saved the northern Scher group, rather than the Scher group forming a distraction to pull units away from the Kotelnikovo group, as had been hoped. On the 14th of December, Manstein ordered the 48th Panzer Corps to hold on to the Don bridgehead, saying it didn't matter how much they held, they just had to hold on to some of it, otherwise its loss would negatively impact the morale of the 6th Army. To me, this suggests that the troops of the 6th Army had more information about what was going on outside the pocket than some historians have suggested they did.
But anyway, Manstein's orders seem to have had an impact, as Rotmistrov attacked at 0730 hours and struggled for the whole day, achieving little. More attacks came in elsewhere, tying down the 11th Panzer Division once more, and the 315th Rifle Division did manage to seize a small bridgehead over the Don south of Nizhny Cherskaya. In the south, the confusing and conflicting accounts make it almost impossible to tell exactly what happened in 6th Panzer Division's area, but it's safe to say that both sides engaged each other in a swirling tank duel as the units of the 4th Mechanized Corps arrived. The Soviet 235th Tank Brigade was armed with flamethrower KV tanks, and in the words of Alexei Isayev, was completely helpless in the face of the German panzers, losing 36 of its tanks. Going off the account of Panzer Commander Friedrich Sander, Hunnersdorf most likely held off the units that had attacked yesterday, then raced his panzers back and forth to intercept and swat away the 59th and 60th Tank Brigades as they arrived in a typical piecemeal fashion. At about 1500 hours, we headed back to Verkhney Kumsky, where in the meantime another large group of Russian tanks, including several 52-ton giants, had attacked. They too had been repelled and 8 had been destroyed. Our own losses have been low, 2 tanks lost and 9 damaged, most of which will be operational again in a few days. In 23rd Panzer Division's area, the 2 Kampfgruppen attacked the Soviets ahead of them and made some progress, with Heidelberg managing to forge a bridgehead across the Aksai River, whilst also threatening to encircle 13th Tank Corps by moving southeast. Trofanov ordered Tanishchin to withdraw across the Aksai to avoid the trap, which Tanishchin did overnight. Rodmistrov's forces captured Verkhny Chersky on the early morning of the 15th of December 1942, losing a few tanks and one of his brigade commanders in the process. Kampfgruppe Sauerbruck was still on the eastern bank though, and the Germans had erected a new line west of Verkhny Chersky to halt the Soviets. But Zorovikino was also captured, so overall it was a good day for the Red Army in this area. 11th Panzer Division had no choice but to stay with the 336th Infantry Division in order to hold the middle of the line and just let the men on the flanks fight their own battles. The good news for the Germans was that for several days from the end of the 15th of December, there was a lull in the fighting along the lower Cher and Don rivers as Soviet forces regrouped and prepared for their next offensive. This gave the Germans hope that they could regain their bridgehead over the Cher and maybe strike towards Stalingrad in the near future. And in Stalingrad itself, hunger gripped the men to the point where some were now struggling to stand up. Previously, in desperation, the quartermaster of the army seized the 4,000 horses of the Romanian cavalry division and slaughtered them. This had helped keep the men afloat over the past couple of days, but on the 15th, the bread ration was again cut to 100 grams. It was now starvation time. 2 slices of bread per day, a thin soup of horse flesh, and some cups of herb tea or malt tea was what the soldier had to fight and live on and withstand frost, snow and storm. Back in the south, the fight continued with the sources on both sides once again contradicting each other. The overall picture seems to be that the 4th Mechanized Corps took Verkhny Kumsky from the 6th Panzer Division, and after several confusing fights and much damage to the Soviet tank and rifle formations, it was reported that the Soviets were striking at Chikov, trying to surround the Germans. To save himself from encirclement, Hunnersdorf was forced that evening to pull back to the Aksai River in order to hold on to the bridgehead. He probably lost 19 panzers on this day alone, while the Soviets lost about 30. We later discovered that the Soviets had lost more than half of their available armour in this heavy struggle. The revolving battle had broken the enemy's armoured backbone and won us, at least temporarily, numerical superiority in tanks. The good news for the Germans was that the Soviets on their flanks were busy falling back to the Aksai River in the face of pressure from the 23rd Panzer Division and Romanian formations. 13th Tank Corps and the 302nd Rifle Division were completely over the Aksai by that evening, while the 126th Rifle Division fell back to Aksai itself, leaving only rear guards to hold the line to the south. This allowed all of 23rd Panzer Division, now reformed into one unit, to forge another bridgehead west of Antonev. This finally brought most of 23rd Panzer Division's forces online with Raus's 6th Panzer Division, theoretically enabling it to attack north towards the Mishkova River in conjunction with Raus's division. However, by this time, 4th Mechanized Corps and its reinforcing units were digging into positions in the hills south of Verkhny Kumsky, doing everything in their power to make these defences a tough nut to crack. Effectively, the Soviets had created a fairly solid blocking line along the Aksai River, although there were a couple of German bridgeheads across it. Thus, Manstein's relief operation was failing. They had been pushed back, and the advance had stalled. Would they be able to get things going again, or would the Soviets be able to block them? Actually, they didn't need to, because something else was about to distract Manstein from its ultimate goal of rescuing the 6th Army. On the 16th of December 1942, the German plan was to have both panzer divisions attack simultaneously to crush the opposition. Raus's repair teams had got 22 of the 30 previously knocked out panzers back in operation, and they had just received a further 42 Stugs, bringing their armoured strength to 100. Rauss's plan was to attack the 4th Mechanised Corps with his entire division, but at the last minute, General Hott intervened again, insisting that they have the panzers of both divisions combine into one Kampfgruppe, with the infantry in another. Rauss wasn't at all pleased by this arrangement, nor were the troops, since it left the tanks vulnerable without sufficient infantry support. So, when the attack went in, it went wrong. The panzers rolled over the Soviet infantry foxholes, but without infantry support, they weren't able to clear them. Even firing at point-blank range wasn't enough to compel the Soviets to retreat, and Soviet anti-tank riflemen and gunners took their toll. In the end, the panzers were forced to fall back, and 4th Mechanised Corps' lines held. 23rd Panzer Division also made little progress against the 13th Tank Corps, and apart from Soviet withdrawals on the flanks, thanks in part to the arrival of the 17th Panzer Division, the 16th of December had basically been a wasted day for the Germans. The Don and Volga rivers had frozen over completely as the temperature plummeted further, and Churikov's 62nd Army, which had been subsisting on rations of chocolate and small supply drops for weeks now, was now able to receive proper supplies. A footway was made over the ice with planks, and later entire motor highways were constructed, allowing thousands of vehicles to supply Churikov in the coming weeks. Soon the men would receive hot food and would be allowed to go back across the Volga to have baths, which would kill the lice that plagued their bodies. Things were looking up for the Soviets. This is in contrast to the Germans. According to Colonel Adam, inside Stalingrad preparations were being made for the breakout, with papers being burnt and all things that couldn't be taken with them prepared to be destroyed. This implies that they were going to abandon Stalingrad entirely, even though this is contradicted by other sources. Still, Paulus supposedly remarked that even with the airlift, their fuel supplies would only grant them a 30-kilometre advance, and that within 4 to 5 days they wouldn't be able to attack at all. Well, 5 days from the 16th takes us to the 21st of December, which means that Manstein has to issue the order to break out before this point. So, really, he only has until the 20th at the very latest to get to the 6th Army if he wants to issue the order for Thunderclap. Time was of the essence, and yet they had spent the day retreating. Also, this fact undermines the argument Adam himself made early on, where he said that Paulus was reluctant to disobey the Führer's orders and break out. He can't break out. He can only go 30 kilometres, which is nowhere near enough. So, Paulus can't break out alone. The end. At the Cher, Group Sauerbruck withdrew over the Don, abandoning the eastern bank and thereby closing 6th Army's hope of a relief or breakout in this direction. And for capturing Surovikino the day before, Danilov's 119th Rifled Division was upgraded to the 54th Guards Rifled Division. Overall then, the situation around Stalingrad was dire for the Germans. Manstein had been stopped at the Aksai, and a sure relief was now off the table. There was still some hope in the form of the 17th Panzer Division, which was just arriving on the left flank of the 57th Panzer Corps, but otherwise prospects were looking bleak. Worse, the 16th of December 1942 would be a decisive day for the entire Eastern Front and the war itself. Far to the west of Stalingrad, thousands of guns opened fire on the Italian lines, as well as those of Army Detachment Hollet. A fresh Soviet offensive was launched, Operation Little Saturn, an offensive that would have dire consequences for the entire southern wing of the Axis Soviet front. For Operation Little Saturn, the Soviets had 5 tank and 2 mechanized corps, followed by a bunch of infantry formations, totaling 425,000 men, of which 370,000 were combat troops. They were supported by 1,200 tanks. The Axis force that they faced had 200,000 men and 100 tanks, so to say that they had overwhelming numbers is an understatement. Yes, another 100,000 Germans would be sent to the area after the crisis began, but the Soviets also received a further 60,000 men as well, so the Soviets absolutely had the advantage. Worse, just 2 Italian divisions and 1 regiment of German security troops faced the main spearhead of the Soviet 1st Guards and 6th Armies. Against 3rd Guards and 5th Tank Armies, Hollet initially had just 2 German infantry divisions with another one and a Luftwaffe division in reserve, what was left of the 22nd Panzer Division and the remnants of 6 Romanian divisions. The 87 Italian aircraft they had lacked fuel and spare parts, and the Romanian and Hungarian air corps were equally as poor. The Germans had 1 air unit in the area, but overall they were outmatched by the 443 Soviet aircraft they faced. So, after the Soviet artillery had battered the Axis lines, the riflemen attacked. Surprisingly, the Italians managed to contain them after an advance of just 3 kilometers, and even conducted some small counterattacks. Just like the Romanians, they hadn't just fled without a fight. The Soviets therefore sent in their tanks, which the Italians resisted as well. On the one hand, the Don was completely frozen over, so they were able to drive straight across the ice, but on the other, they rolled directly into the minefields that their sappers had failed to clear. Such was the failure of the attack in the morning that Army Group Don didn't believe it was a full offensive, just a reconnaissance in force. But in the afternoon, the Romanian 14th Infantry Division collapsed against the weight of pressure from the 14th Rifle Corps, and the German 294th Infantry Division was smashed by the 14th Guards Rifle Division, supported by the 114th Tank Regiment. Therefore, there were hints that this was something bigger. On the 17th, the Soviets regrouped and integrated their armour and infantry forces together into combined arms units. Suddenly they had success, as the Italian defences simply disintegrated. 3 Italian divisions were encircled and had to break out or otherwise flee, with most of their officers lacking maps of the rear areas, and Soviet partisans attacked them repeatedly. The Soviets hadn't even sent in their full force yet, with the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps only joining the battle on the 19th. But by this point, all the lines, Italian, German, Romanian, didn't matter. They were all smashed and their units were withdrawing. In fact, a 150-kilometre gap had been torn in the Axis line. The Italian 9th and 11th Divisions and the German 62nd Infantry Division were all surrounded and subsequently destroyed. Some Italian units retreated constantly throughout the rest of December, and in one case marched for 250 kilometres until the line stabilised. Of the thousands captured during these withdrawals, hundreds died in the freezing temperatures during forced marches across the Don to various railheads where they were loaded on trains bound for prisoner-of-war camps. What gets me though is that the left flank of the Italian army hadn't been attacked yet, but was slow to respond to the danger. One Alpine division foraged for food as it had completely ran out, while one of its artillery batteries spent the day chopping down trees to make sleds in preparation to move its equipment because there weren't enough trucks. The men had to take turns because there were only 4 axes in the whole battery. In other words, Nero was fiddling as Rome was burning. Jumping ahead slightly, on the 22nd, Hitler ordered Army Group Don to establish a defensive line along a certain sector, but 2 Soviet tank corps had already passed that position by that point. Such was the rapidness of the advance. On the same day, Manstein said that Operation Little Saturn had to be stopped before he could continue the advance towards Stalingrad, which may have been an excuse by that point, but otherwise indicates the severity of the situation. Manstein's entire army group was being threatened with encirclement, and forces were about to be taken from him in order to shore it up. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves slightly here, but the point is that Operation Little Saturn was a major threat to the entire southern front, and was about to make the idea of saving Paulus and the Sixth Army a complete fantasy. What's also interesting is that Manstein had complained about the 17th Panzer Division not being sent to him earlier. But just a couple of days before Operation Little Saturn was launched, Hitler finally relented to Manstein and allowed it to move east. Then, Operation Little Saturn happened, and the Axis had basically nothing in reserve. While one Panzer Division probably wouldn't have changed the overall outcome of Little Saturn, it may have helped delay the Soviet advance, saved some more Axis divisions, and done significant damage to the Soviet tank formations. Hitler and the High Command had known about the build-up opposite the Italian 8th Army, which was why the 17th Panzer Division had remained in reserve. It was Manstein that had persuaded them to pull it away, causing the flank to collapse even faster than it otherwise would have done. But back on the 17th, Richthofen was ordered to send 2 of his bomber wings to support Army Group Don. He rang Jesenek and told him that this would deprive him of a third of the units he was supporting Manstein's sector with. He said it would effectively be abandoning the Sixth Army to its fate, which he called murder. Nonetheless, it had to be done. Overall, the Axis were in serious trouble. It was no longer just about saving the Sixth Army. They had to save the entire southern front. Priorities had changed, and the 4 Panzer divisions in Army Group Don were desperately needed further west. This would put a significant time constraint on the relief operation. If they didn't get to the Sixth Army in the next few days, that was it. Game over. This is assuming it wasn't game over already, which it probably was. With Manstein still miles away and the Sixth Army starving, the events of the next couple of days would be decisive. Can Manstein go the distance? Can Paulus hold on? And can the Soviets end the relief attempt once and for all? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.